Okay, good evening and welcome to our midweek Bible study. We had to get Judy sat down here because she was still yakking. Okay, tonight we're going to look at God's dwelling place. God's dwelling place. We might say, well, you can't contain God. And that is true. You cannot contain God because He is an infinite being who is omnipresent. He is everywhere at any time. But yet we find in Scripture that God has said there is a chosen place where He will demonstrate the fact that He is dwelling among man in a specific spot. And this psalm tonight by David is one in which we find a description of that spot given to us. So let's read through this. And again, this is one of the psalms that is an ascent psalm. So as the Jews were going to Jerusalem, they would either sing this or recite it on that journey up to Jerusalem for the feasts. Psalm 132, written by David, it says, "Lord, remember David and all his afflictions, how he swore to the Lord and vowed to the Mighty One of Jacob, surely I will not go into the chamber of my house or go up to the comfort of my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the Mighty One of Jacob. Behold, we heard of it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of the woods. Let us go into his tabernacle. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, to your resting place. You in the ark of your strength, let your priests be clothed with righteousness and your servants shout for joy. For your servant David's sake, do not turn away the face of your anointed. The Lord has sworn in truth to David, he will not turn from it. I will set upon your throne the fruit of your body. If your sons will keep my covenant and my testimony, which I shall teach them, their sons also shall sit upon your throne forever. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. I will abundantly bless her provision, and I will satisfy her poor with bread. I will also clothe her priests with salvation, and her saints shall shout aloud for joy. There I will make the horn of David grow. I will prepare a lamp for my anointed. His enemies I will clothe with shame, but upon himself his crown shall flourish." And let's pray. Father, we thank you for another psalm to look at tonight. We thank you for the things you'll teach us from this tonight. I pray that we'll, by your Spirit, understand this psalm. And then as we draw from it the things that we can learn, we pray that you'll bless us. So thank you for the time to focus our minds upon your word. And thank you for the things that David has written for us in so many of these psalms. Bless, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, in this psalm, we have an expression primarily, if you were to have a theme of this psalm, David talks about God's dwelling place, but this theme of which he writes about in this psalm is really David's love for God. It's his love for God that motivates him to provide this dwelling place, as we will see, and then to describe it as being God's dwelling place. Now, essentially, what is going on in this psalm here, David describes how the temple gets to Jerusalem. And then he describes the significance of the temple. This just wasn't a thing on David's behalf that he wanted someplace for God to be known. That's a good intent. But really, the thing that we see in here is that David expresses a desire towards the Lord because of his love for him. And then God grants and approves of that desire, ultimately establishing what he had promised long ago to the children of Israel by this moment in time with David. We'll note in this psalm here that when God does things and accomplishes what he accomplishes, it's always according to his time frame. And it may seem like a long time in our view of things, but yet it is right on the money with God because he always has people, events, and things in place, and that is right at the time in which he has those things planned. So as we look at David's love for God tonight, let's first of all look at David's purpose. Why does he write this psalm? What is the motivation behind telling us these things? Well, in the first 9 verses, we have described for us David's purpose, and that is a house for God. A house for God. Verse 5, he says, "Until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob." He uses a couple of terms here to describe God. First one, Lord, is Jehovah. This is the one that we find God has identified himself to the children of Israel as, I am Jehovah. But then he also describes him as being the mighty one of Jacob. And also running through this is a description of what was representative of God's presence. We'll see this in a moment. But he says of God that God is the mighty one of Jacob. In other words, he's the one that can do anything. And this representation of him has been witness to many of the impossible things that God has done for the children of Israel. So he says, I want to find a place for the Lord, a house for the Lord. And the situation here is that David, having established Jerusalem, of Israel, David had built himself a house, a palace in the city of David. And by the way, we know this is true and not just a part of a good story that we find in the Old Testament, because today you can go to Jerusalem, you can find the city of David, and in the city of David, they have portions today that they believe belong to the palace of David, the house of David. Well, David had a house in Jerusalem. This is where he lived. And yet he looked around and saw all that had been established and said, there's something missing here. And what is missing is that for over 500 years, after having entered into the land of Canaan, there really had not been established a permanent place for God, for the temple of God, what was in place at this point in time was a tabernacle. And the tabernacle came with the children of Israel into the land of Canaan. And 500 years previous to this was when it arrived with the children of Israel and then was set up in Shiloh. And it had been there ever since. And in between, there had been things that had happened with items within the tabernacle, one of which was the Ark of the Covenant. And at this point in time that David is writing this psalm, it is on the heels of an event in which Israel has finally decided, with David's leadership, we need to bring the Ark of the Covenant back into prominence again because it represents the presence of God. Now you notice in the text here, David says in verse 6, "Behold, we heard of it in Ephrathah." Heard of what? Well, the words that are used in verse 5 are words that are used to refer to the Ark of the Covenant. For when the Ark of the Covenant began to make its journey, as Israel was wandering through the wilderness, when they began to make the journey, they would say, the priests would, as they lifted up the Ark of the Covenant via the poles to carry it, They would say, "Arise, O Lord." And then when it came time for it to settle again, then they would say, "Here is your," I'm paraphrasing here, but "here is your resting place. Settle down, so to say, O Lord." And the reason they said this to the Ark of the Covenant wasn't that they believed the Ark of the Covenant was God, but the Ark of the Covenant, God said, is where I will be. It is where I will dwell among my people. And so the glory of God, when the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the most holy of holies, would descend and there be residing between the cherubim. And so for the Israelites, it was a significant thing that represented the settled presence of God. God said, "I will speak to you from between the cherubim." So what has happened here is that David says in verse 6, "Behold, we have heard of it in Ephrathah." Now, Ephrathah is another description of Bethlehem. It's the region that Bethlehem is in. That's why Micah 5:2 says, "In Bethlehem Ephrathah." It's to settle it as being the place where David's birthplace was. And so he says, "We have heard of it." We heard, David says, of the ark. We heard of it in our hometown, he's saying here. And then he says, "We found it in the fields of the woods," describing the fact that there was a point in time at which there was a specific search for and then finding the Ark of the Covenant. Now go over to 1 Samuel chapter 7. 1 Samuel chapter 7. 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verses 1 and 2 gives us a little bit of a history here of where the ark was. Now, this is back in the time of Samuel, the prophet, the judge, the last judge of Israel. And Samuel's the one who anointed Saul and David to be kings. So in the early part of Samuel's ministry, there was a battle with the Philistines. And at this battle, the Philistines, it didn't go well with Israel. Why? Because the ark of the Lord was brought into the battle because Israel figured this is the way we get God on our side. It was captured by the Philistines, and Israel was defeated by the Philistines that day. Well, when they took the Ark of the Covenant, the Philistines were judged by the Lord for 7 months. Finally said, "Enough of this," and they put it on a cart, and they let the cart go, and the cart headed into Israel. And when it finished up in Israel, it ended up here in 1 Samuel chapter 7. So verse 1, it says, "Then the men of Kirjath-jearim came and took the ark of the Lord and brought it into the house of Abinadab on the hill, and consecrated Eleazar his son to keep the ark of the Lord. And so it was that the ark remained in Kirjath-jearim a long time. It was there 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord." Okay, so by the time we get to David, we're past the time frame of Samuel, but the problem is the ark is not back in the tabernacle in Shiloh. The ark is still in Kirjath-jearim. And we know this because in 1 Chronicles chapter 15, we have the record here where David, having found the ark, then brings it back to the city of David. But where does he bring it from? Well, 1 Chronicles 15. 1 Chronicles 15. It says, well, let's see. Let's go back. We need to go back just a little bit here to chapter 13. 1 Chronicles 13. And look at verse 1. It says, "Then David consulted with the captains of thousands, hundreds, and every leader, and said to all the assembly of Israel, If it seems good to you, and if it is of the Lord our God, let us send out to our brethren everywhere who are left in the land of Israel, and with them to the priests and Levites who are in the city in their common lands, that we may gather together to us, and let us bring the ark of our God back to us. For we have not inquired of it since the days of Saul. Verse 5. So David gathered all Israel together from Shihor in Egypt to as far as the entrance of Hamath to bring the ark of God from, notice what it says, Kirjath-jearim. And David and all Israel went up to Bela to Kirjath-jearim, which belonged to Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, the Lord, who dwells between the cherubim, where his name is proclaimed. And so they carried the ark of God on a new cart from the house of Abinadab. Okay, this is the same individual, same place, where we find the ark had been residing for a long time. So then in 1 Corinthians Chronicles, if I say Corinthians, it's Chronicles right now because we're in the Old Testament. 1 Chronicles chapter 15. And in verses 1 and 3, we find here that it says, David built houses for himself in the city of David. That's what we talked about earlier. That's where Psalm 132 is. And he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. Then David said, no one may carry the ark of God but the Levites, for the Lord has chosen them to carry the ark of God and to minister before him forever. And David gathered all Israel together at Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Lord to its place, which he had prepared for it. Okay, so David then in Psalm 132 here talks about the fact that the ark had been missing since the Philistines took it. And in verse 6, he says, we found where it is. And so then David then is returning the ark. He's bringing it back to a place where it should be. And that is in a specific spot, and in a specific spot here happens to be in Jerusalem. Now, is this just happenstance? Well, it's not. See, God had moved upon the heart of David to desire to will dwell. And he's using David here to accomplish this purpose. But the interesting thing is that this is well into 500 years after Israel has come into the land of Canaan. You would have thought that over the course of 500 years, they would have already built a temple. They would have already established a place. They would have already had Jerusalem. But guess who's the one who conquered Jerusalem? It was David. And David, having conquered Jerusalem, then places within the realm of ownership of Israel the place that God said is going to be his city. So see, here we find it wasn't God was taking a long time to get there. It was that in his plan and scheme of things here, David is the one who's been chosen of God to do this, who has this desire. And so therefore, leading up to this time, we do have a long gap, but David is being used of God to do this. So then we find in verse 7, David says, let us go into his tabernacle and let us worship at his footstool. He describes here the fact that the ark was placed in a tent. For he says, let us go into his tabernacle. And tabernacle is a tent. And this is what we find described for us in 1 Chronicles 15, because David set up a tent, a place for the Lord to dwell, for his ark to be placed. So go to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Chronicles. It's going to be one of those nights, huh? 1 Chronicles chapter 16. 1 Chronicles 16. And notice verse 1. Actually, 1 through 3. It says, so they brought the ark of God and set it in the midst of the tabernacle or tent that David had erected for it. And then they offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before God. And when David had finished offering the peace offerings, or the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord. And then he distributed to every one of Israel, both man and woman, to everyone a loaf of bread, a piece of meat, and a cake of raisins. And then it describes that he set up Levites to minister to the Lord. So what David says here in Psalm 132, verse 7, is now he's encouraging all the Jews, come to where God's presence is. Come to where God is, where he is in our midst, so that we can in turn worship at his footstool. Find the ark was placed by David in a tent. And then in verses 8 through 9, we find that David expresses to the Lord his desire for a permanent place for the ark. A permanent place for the ark. Verse 8, he says, "Arise, O Lord, to your resting place, you and the ark of your strength." Now, this is a combination of the statement that was made by the Levites when they came to the place where they were to camp, and then they were setting up the tabernacle again. When they put the ark within the Holy of Holies, then they would make this statement and say, "Arise, O Lord, to your resting place." And in so saying, they were speaking to the ark or about the ark. But the significance again is once they make this statement, then this Shekinah glory descends and God dwells between the cherubim in the Holy of Holies. Well, David says here, "Arise, O Lord, to your resting place, you and the ark of your strength." So he's describing the fact that there's going to be a permanent place where God dwells, where his ark is, and he is in between the cherubim on the mercy seat there. Verse 9, "Let your priests be clothed with righteousness, and let your saints shout for joy." Why? Because there's going to be a permanent place where we can go and meet with our God. So you can imagine as the Jews are making this pilgrimage up to Jerusalem, and they begin to see the city, and then they begin to see where the temple has been built on the Temple Mount. The anticipation of being able to be with God as they see the place where he is. They're challenged to love and anticipate being with God. You see, David says here early on in this psalm, verse 2, how he swore to the Lord and vowed to the Mighty One of Jacob, "Surely I will not go into the chamber of my house or go up to the comfort of my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord." What was he describing here? An intense love and anticipation of being with God. A place where he could go and meet God. So surely the pilgrims were reminded of this as they trudged their way up to Jerusalem. Then we find David not only describes here his love for God and the purpose of a house for God, we find secondly David's confidence in God's faithfulness. David's confidence in God's faithfulness. This is verses 10 through 12. And in this confidence, we find David says this, "For your servant David's sake, do not turn away the face of your anointed." Now, there are two things that are going on here. The first is David is literally talking about his descendants. And the fact that God had promised to David that he would have descendants who would reign upon his throne. And those descendants were anointed as kings. So they are referred to as anointed ones. That is a kind of a topographical or initial reference that is happening here in these verses. David's talking about them. But really, it is deeper than David just talking about his descendants. For the descendants God promised would reign over Israel if they would be obedient to God. God would keep them on the throne and they would reign forever as the kings of Israel. But what's interesting is that when David here in verse 10 talks about your anointed, the word anointed here is Messiah. So in these next three verses, what we find David really referring to is a future Davidic king whom God has promised, who is the anointed king. This is a king that is set out different from all the other ones because he is the one who is anointed or chosen of God. And he is described here as turning the anointed or chosen one, turning his face away from David's lineage. So this sets this individual a little bit apart from David's line. But David is saying, for the sake of what you have promised to me, keep your promise about this one in the future, that he will still be of this lineage. Now, what do we find God says here? Well, there's the promise of the anointed king, verse 2, God's chosen king, or 10. Then there's the promise of a descendant king. There's a promise of a descendant king. So not only is this anointed king God's chosen one specifically, but he is a descendant of David. Verse 11, the Lord has sworn in truth to David, and he will not turn from it. I will set upon your throne the fruit of your body. Now, Psalm 89, from which this also is a quote, and 1 Samuel, where God made the promise to David that he would have on his throne his descendants, is a fulfillment of what God had promised. God promised David, I like your desire that you want to build a temple for me, but you can't do it because you're a man of blood. And because you're a man of blood, then your son is going to build it. And who ended up building the temple? It was Solomon. But God said to David, I want you to know, I'm not turning away from you. I'm not setting you aside because Solomon is going to do what you really desire. God said to David, listen, I've got a promise for you. And he told David there would be a descendant that you have who will reign forever and ever. This was the beginning of the Davidic promise of a Davidic king. And here it's reiterated in Psalm 132. Because David says this anointed king, verse 10, is the same one, verse 11, whom God says is going to reign as my descendant. So one of the markers of looking for this anointed king is the lineage coming down from David to that king. And then the third thing we see in here in verse 12 is the promise of an obedient king. The promise of an obedient king. Verse 12, if your sons will keep my covenant, my testimony, which I shall teach them, their sons also shall sit upon the throne, your throne forevermore. Well, what do we know happened with the Davidic line? They ended up not obeying God, and because of that, God's judgment came upon the Davidic line. And it started with Solomon. Because Solomon did not obey God, he ended up having only one of the tribes of Israel, Judah, in his kingdom. The rest were given away, divided out. And God said, the reason I'm keeping within your kingdom of Judah, actually two of them, the reason I'm keeping two kingdoms in your, or two tribes in your kingdom is because of my promise to David, your father. But what we find is that God promises here, yeah, your sons are going to disobey, and because of that, they're not going to, reign forever, but there will be one who is an obedient son who will reign forever. And David mentions these things. Why? Because he shows here that God has made a promise, and guess what this promise is tied to? It's an interesting thing, but this promise that God made to David is actually tied back to the existence of a temple. Because God gave this promise to David when he told David, you're not going to build the temple, but your son will. But there will be a descendant that reigns. So when the Jews were coming up to Jerusalem, not only did they see the city and the temple, but when they came to Jerusalem, and here's a Davidic king reigning in Jerusalem with the temple still there, with God's presence still there, he's saying, I'm dwelling among my people. Guess who's been keeping his promise? God has been. So David mentions these things. Why? Because of a confidence in God's faithfulness. What God promises, he will do. Today we can look back and see that there is the fulfillment of this promise, and it is yet to be completed. The fulfilling of it is Jesus Christ, because he's of the Davidic line. He obeyed to the cross, and because he obeyed to the cross, he was obedient to God, Hebrews says. Jesus is going to be the one who, of the line of David in the future, is going to reign on the throne of David in Jerusalem. There's a third thing we see in this passage, and that is David's assurance in God's choice. David's assurance in God's choice. Verses 13 through 18 is the reminder that this city that they are trudging towards is God's choice. First of all, verses 13 through 14, David describes God's choice of a city. God could have chosen any city within Israel, but he chose Jerusalem. For the Lord has chosen Zion, he's desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it, God says. You know, God mentioned to Israel that there was going to be a city in which he dwells, even before they came into the land of Canaan. He promised them that I will dwell among you, and there will be a city in which I will dwell. Well, here David is describing, as you come up to Jerusalem, this is God's choice of a city. Again, today we look at Jerusalem, we don't see God dwelling there. There's not a temple. But in the future, King Jesus is going to reign from Jerusalem during the millennial kingdom, in which there is a temple. And King Jesus reigns from there. God does and will keep his promise. And even though Jerusalem today is not where God is, it is still God's choice of a city. So keep your eye on Jerusalem and what goes on there in the future. Secondly, we see his assurance in God's choice, God's blessing of the city. God's blessing of the city. Verse 15, I will abundantly bless her provision. I will satisfy her poor with bread. I will also clothe her priests with salvation, and her saints shall shout aloud for joy. Not only is there the blessing of the physical needs, but there's the blessing of the spiritual need. Because God says her priests are going to be righteous. They'll be clothed with salvation. And so as they're making this trudging trip up to Jerusalem, they're reminded that here is where God is blessing his people. Thirdly, God's future for the city. Notice God's future for the city, verses 17 through 18. Here we find God himself brings back around what David had mentioned earlier in verse 10. For verse 17, God says, therefore I will make the horn of David grow. And the horn describes a king, a kingdom. It carries that idea, one who is reigning. So he says, I will make the horn of David grow, and I will prepare a lamp for my anointed. Now God talks about the anointed. David mentions your anointed in verse 10. God says, now I'm going to talk about my anointed. The two are the same because they're both Messiah. And God says here, Messiah arises out of a Davidic line. He's a Davidic king because he is a lamp and a horn in Jerusalem. In verse 18, he describes the triumph of Messiah in that he says, his enemies I will clothe with shame, but upon himself his crown shall flourish. God's future for the city is that Messiah reigns from it as a Davidic king. And while the promise has not been yet fulfilled, as this psalm is recited, the Jews are reminded that even though there may not be a Davidic king, God has promised that one day there will be a Davidic king reigning in Jerusalem on the throne of David, who is God's anointed one, the Messiah. You know, it's interesting that the Jews today do look for the Davidic Messiah. They don't look for Jesus, the suffering Messiah, but they do look for the Davidic Messiah, the son of David. Why? Because he comes and reigns. You know, and it's the anticipation of the kingdom of God in a real sense reigning over them. But they miss all the other aspects that are described here by David of Messiah, who is the one reigning over Israel, who is the faithful, obedient son who has fulfilled the covenant relationship of Israel with God himself. Therefore provides for man what man can't do. Provides salvation for them, cleansing of their sin. So God's dwelling place, as described here by David in Psalm 132, was a reminder for the Jews, a man that loved and anticipated being with God. Which naturally begged the question, do I love to anticipate being with God? As I'm making this journey to Jerusalem, they could ask themselves, do I love and anticipate God? But as we look at it, we can ask the same question. To love and anticipate being with God. Be confident in God's faithfulness. David said, remember, there's going to be an anointed king of the line of David who will reign in Jerusalem. And as they saw that literally every time they went to Jerusalem, the Jews did, they were reminded of God's faithfulness because here's a king, here's the temple, and God says in the future this will happen. Well, today we look at it and it's not there, but God has not gone back on his word. Because there's still Jerusalem, the city, and there's still the location where the temple was. We can be confident that what God says in the future will happen. If those disappear, then we will have a problem. And then we're reminded here of David's assurance in God's choice. Jerusalem is God's blessed city where Messiah will reign. And they were urged to look beyond just the king that physically reigned there in their time to Jesus, the king in the future, the Messiah king who would be there. So we are as well. But we're also reminded that Jerusalem is God's choice of a city. It's his place that he has chosen. Right now it's not blessed because they're not acknowledging their king, Jesus. But one day it will be blessed as it was in the past because King Jesus reigns and is acknowledged there. God's dwelling place, Jerusalem. Psalm 132. Okay, I trust the Lord will bless that to your heart tonight and to your thinking and meditation for the rest of the week. And again, if you have any prayer requests, you can text them to either Tammy or I. and we'll make sure we get them out. Right now, you can pray for several things. One, pray for Evelyn. She is not feeling really well. She's doing a little bit better, but do need to pray for her that God will strengthen her body physically so that she does gain some refreshment and recovery here from the sickness that she's got right now. So keep praying for her. And then Brother Carl's been having some difficulties, so pray for him as well. And let's see, there's another one. Is that all of them? Okay, that's all those on that. Let me give you a quick, about 3 or 4 minute update on situation in the States, okay? Because we do need to be praying about this. Number one, you need to understand that what you saw with or if you haven't heard about it, didn't see about it, this afternoon there were some rioters, protesters. They were labeled as Trump protesters who broke through the police barrier and then stormed the Capitol building, busted out some windows, and then got inside, and one of them, a young lady, was shot, and she unfortunately passed away. Well, first off, the majority of Trump supporters are not of this ilk. Okay, they're not of this kind. This kind is very much like the Antifa kind. And so they're not Trump supporters. Yeah, they went in and they said that they were. They had, the markings and the flags draped over them as Trump supporters, but their actions are very much like this Antifa stuff. And so they're probably a mix of that kind. And the reason I say that is I watched some video of these protesters, Trump protesters, as they were breaking out the windows in the Capitol building. And they had plastic plexiglass shields. They had helmets on, like Army helmets on. They had riot kind of protection gear. And so this is, these kind of things are characteristic of this Antifa type of crowd. One of the guys that was pictured having gotten into the Senate chamber, House chamber, where all the dealings of law and so forth are done, got up into the chair where if you watch the president's State of the Union address, you have the House Speaker sitting here and the Vice President sitting here. And he got up into the chair there, and a picture was taken of him. 2 individuals. The one individual's been identified as for lack of a better term, professional protester who has been seen at many BLM, Black Lives Matter type of protests. That's not a Trump supporter. The second guy that was pictured in it was definitely dressed out like Antifa type of individual. So I say all that to say this. Part of it is to shape the narrative so that what has happened is termed as an insurrection against the United States and its government on behalf of and incited by President Trump. And so then, along with that, is to label all of Trump's supporters as being these kind of people and responsible for causing an insurrection against democracy in the United States. So those are pretty clear facts about what happened this afternoon. So don't let that don't let that taint or sway your perception of Trump supporters, because that's where the narrative is going. But do be praying that what does need to happen is a thorough investigation of the fraud that has occurred in the United States. There was more of it last night in Georgia. There was 32,000 votes that were moved from one candidate to the other, and it was filmed live as it was happening. In other words, as the numbers are coming in, it was shown on the screen, the switching. So there is this very real stuff going on that does not, if it's not investigated and corrected, sets the groundwork for really, impossible elections in the future, to be honest and fair. So pray that there is a road in which this does and is dealt with. The third thing is the reality that America very much and very realistically is getting what America is. America is a corrupt, morally depraved, godless nation. And the type of rulers that are in are those kind of people. The type of rulers that have been voted in and that people want are those kind of people. And in some ways, these types of things do have to happen, because when you look in the future into prophecy, the United States is not in the picture. It's not in the picture as a force for good. It's not in the picture as a force for bad. It's just not there. And the United States has been for a long time a representation of what is good and right and just, and has been the provider of those kinds of things. So something has to happen. These types of things that are coming up now and showing and manifesting themselves in the U.S. are very characteristic of the culture and the heart of a lot of people in the United States. More so than, well, it would be safe to say a majority of people in the United States. And that has to happen in order for prophecy to be fulfilled. At the same time, you hate to have to acknowledge it, but the facts are there. This is, in reality, very much what is happening. The end result of it is that God is definitely taking away from people any reliance upon anything else. COVID has taken out the reliance on the entertainment industry and all that sports stuff could give you as a distraction of life. COVID has taken out the dependence upon a good job and security. COVID has taken out the confidence of my own ability to sustain myself and to keep myself well. It's also, God has taken away from the United States the dependence upon government to be honest and right, and is knocking away all these props so that believers really have to get to the place where the only place they can turn is to the Lord, and they need to. Because really what the U.S. needs right now is strong believers who are standing on truth and will stand for truth and do what is right, no matter what the crowd is wanting to do. So that took about 9 minutes, sorry. But that's kind of the picture of what is going on right now in the United States. It looks very real, like Biden will be the next president of the United States. And so we are headed down that road again, but only this time there is a much greater desire and push to get well down that road as opposed to the Obama administration beforehand. So that's people really, believers really need to turn their hearts towards the Lord and just be confident in Him, that He is a safe dwelling place rather than government or men. So, however, pray that God will do what He's going to do and help and grace those that do what is right in this stuff. Okay, so don't forget Sunday morning. We'll meet here for our morning service, and then we'll also have a baptism afterwards on Sunday, Peter Reinsberger. And so we'll be able to celebrate his confession of faith in the Lord and obedience to the Lord in this matter on baptism on Sunday. All right, Lord bless you. We'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for joining us tonight.